of the biggest problems from the war has been that in Russian society and Russian politics more broadly, there's always been these sort of informal patronage networks where people are able to amass huge amounts of wealth disproportionate to their salaries, and that's always been broadly tolerated. What was interesting was that when the Ukrainians were able to seize parts of southern Russia in the Kursk region last year, which, by the way, was something that I think should have been anticipated by the Russian side, given that the Ukrainians tried a few times to do that and then ultimately were successful. What it showed was that Russia's southern border was extremely vulnerable, not because of anything military, but it was due to the corruption networks in the south of Russia, where the regional governor had hugely enriched himself and taken away a lot of funding and kind of on the cheap constructed border fences in the south.
Our Times colleague Roger Boys wrote earlier this week about the Russian capital, Moscow, informed by his experience of many years in Eastern Europe. The city, according to him, now seems to exist in a bubble, sheltered from Vladimir Putin's war. There are no air raid sirens there. They are commonplace now in Russian townships close to Ukraine, but not there. And there are few military recruitment posters. The restaurants are also full. The reason, he says, is clear. Putin's war's largely been farmed out to the provinces, where young men are offered up as cannon fodder. But the two-tier war is likely to become a political problem for Putin as soon as the fighting slows down. As a new research paper by Emily Ferris, the senior Russia analyst for RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, details. Good afternoon, Emily.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Your paper identifies four future flashpoints. Let's walk through them. Domestic terrorism.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. So I think what the paper is really about is trying to understand the allocation of resources. So in a war where huge amount of resources are being allocated to the front line, what that does is create domestic security gaps back in Russia. And a major consequence of that is not having the kind of intelligence resources, the manpower, and I suppose even really the political will to investigate and I suppose preempt acts of terrorism, which is why actually in Russia over the last couple of years and since the war, there's been kind of a resurgence in terrorism domestically.
So we could imagine Muscovites suffering the kind of terrorism that I think we remember from the attack in the theatre and so on.
Absolutely. So last year there was a major terrorist attack in a concert hall in Moscow. Almost 150 people were killed. And I think what was kind of interesting about that was that there were multiple opportunities for the security services for the FSB to have anticipated it and even prevented it. And some of these are not even particularly secret. There were warnings by both the Americans and the Iranians that there was going to be a major terrorist attack in Moscow. I suppose you could probably, understand Moscow's reticence for ignoring a warning from the Americans claiming that this was politicized. But to ignore a stark warning like that from their own allies, the Iranians, it's rather strange. And that's not the only example of terrorism in Russia. There's been quite a resurgence in the North Caucasus, lots of different attacks on religious sites. There have been sort of prison riots that have all maintained that they have some sort of link to the authorities' kind of heavy-handed approach to terrorism more broadly in Russia. So there is something sort of bubbling under the surface at the moment of Russian society that I think is quite concerning.
You also identified that if the war slows down and Putin demobilizes, brings home some of the men that he's got on the front line, that presents a risk too.
It does, and that's something that the Russians, or I suppose at the time the Soviets, knew very well of from Afghanistan and then from the Chechen wars and even the Second World War. So they do have some experience with trying to reintegrate veterans from conflict back into society. And previously that's not been very successful. There's been a sort of rise in crime, people coming back with post-traumatic stress disorder, and a social net that's not very well framed in terms of assisting people with resources. But the Kremlin's approach to this has been to try to integrate veterans in politics. There's also a huge sort of far-right movement in Russia that's growing all the time, especially in response to the war. There's a chance that lots of veterans, perhaps disillusioned with the war, might be mopped up by those groups as well. And if you add to that, people who are potentially with criminal records, people who are perhaps, more unstable as a result of seeing difficult things during the conflict. I think that is kind of a bit of a recipe for social disaster.
So we've got terrorism, we've got the potential of demobilization, which, by the way, when I read about it, it reminded me of essentially that was part of what provoked the Russian Revolution a century ago, return of Russian soldiers from the front. And then there's a relationship between the Kremlin and big business, or if you like, gangster business in Russia. The people who've got procurement and construction contracts and so on, not to mention that some of them might feel unsafe now. Is there a potential that Putin and the Kremlin may fall out with some of the people that they've made extremely rich?
Well, one of the biggest problems from the war has been that in Russian society and Russian politics more broadly, there's always been these sort of informal patronage networks where people are able to amass huge amounts of wealth disproportionate to their salaries, and that's always been broadly tolerated. What was interesting was that when the Ukrainians were able to seize parts of southern Russia in the Kursk region last year, which, by the way, was something that I think should have been anticipated by the Russian side, given that the Ukrainians tried a few times to do that and then ultimately were successful. What it showed was that Russia's southern border was extremely vulnerable, not because of anything military, but it was due to the corruption networks in the south of Russia, where the regional governor had hugely enriched himself and taken away a lot of funding and kind of on the cheap constructed border fences in the south. And as a result, they were very easily penetrated by the Ukrainian forces. So what happened there was it kind of showed the limits of this self-enrichment and of this corruption. And when it starts to impact on the war, it seems that that is a bit of a red line for the Kremlin, because eventually, this regional governor who became the transport minister was then dismissed. A lot of criminal investigations were opened into his associates, and those are still ongoing. And he sort of committed suicide a few months ago. So it seems that there is a limit to some of these patronage networks, even when these people are linked to very powerful business people, as they were, who even have the ear of Putin, the ear of the Kremlin. It doesn't actually matter, because the war is kind of the organizational logic through which all relationships are being seen at the moment in Russia.
So finally, Emily, what does all this add up to for the war? Is it just an annoyance for Putin, or is it, if you like, a burning platform that if all of these things start to happen, his effort could unravel and weaken the war effort?
Some of these things, I think, do impact the war in terms of resources, but the main point is that for Russia, the military resources will always be prioritized at the expense of their own people. So unfortunately, where there are infrastructure and educational problems, those will always be sidelined and budgets apportioned accordingly in service of the ultimate goal, which is the war, because the ideology is so powerful and has become the driving force of all of the Kremlin's foreign and, frankly, domestic policy decisions at the moment.
Emily, thank you so much. That's absolutely fascinating. It was Emily Ferris, Senior Russia Analyst for the Royal United Services Institute.